Hello and welcome to another Ask an Author episode. I am very, very excited to be joined by a very talented author who is in the middle of a trilogy, which is something I think a little bit new for us here at Ask an Author. And so we're going to be talking about book two and perhaps a little bit of book one in this trilogy. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks for everyone who's tuning in. I'm Signe Pike. I'm the author of The Lost Queen, and most recently, The Forgotten Kingdom, which just came out in paperback on Tuesday, the second book in the trilogy.
Yes. So congratulations on the release of The Forgotten Kingdom, and congratulations on so many people within this group have popped up and said how much they loved the first book and how excited they are to see this second book come out.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's always nice to hear.
Of course. So we're going to be focusing mostly, I think, on The Forgotten Kingdom, the new book today. But perhaps you could set up a little bit of what readers can expect with this trilogy, and then maybe we can dive into this book in particular.
Okay, so what's interesting about the Lost Queen trilogy is that this trilogy supposes that there were real historical figures who underpin the Arthurian legend. And my work is based on new scholarship that's come out in the last couple of decades that place Merlin and Arthur in southern Scotland in the 6th century. And when scholars began to place them in that geographic location, all sorts of puzzle pieces that other theorists had trouble putting together just fell into place. But one of the most integral puzzle pieces is a queen who has lived in the 6th century named Lingorith. And she would have been one of the most powerful queens of early medieval Scotland. And she was, in fact, a real historical figure. And it's her brother, Lailochen, who we believe is the man who inspired the legend of Merlin. So these three books detail their lives and the events in their lives. And I'm trying to resurrect their memories for the modern reader.
It's such a fascinating approach because, as you say, you're taking something that sort of looms large in myth, but then putting this new scholarship and these new findings to it, and sort of giving a new, fresh take on this story. It's such an interesting way to present something that kind of skirts between fiction and history.
Mm-hmm. And what's funny is looking back, I would love to say that I'm one of the first people to do this, but since the beginning of time, the Arthurian legend is by far one of the most captivating legends. And from Geoffrey of Monmouth and Mallory, all the way up to Bernard Cornwell and the Once and Future King and the Mists of Avalon. I mean, this legend has been done to death. However, we keep finding new ways to make it live again. And that's what's so exciting. And especially thinking, I always love to believe that within every myth or every legend, there's a kernel of truth. Mm-hmm. And so to be researching these little kernels and constructing them into a broader narrative for me is really exciting.
So there's so many things that I want to talk with you about, especially around sort of those kernels of truth and building out a story from there. But perhaps it would be a good idea to start with what people where we are in the story when people pick up this book.
So The Forgotten Kingdom opens the prologue. You're in the aftermath of a terrible battle, and you're in the point of view of Lailochen, who is Lingorith's brother, who we now call Merlin. And he actually survived. Legend says he survived this battle and then went into exile for 7 years. So the first part of the book covers the aftermath of the battle. Then we go back in time to a year before the battle, which is where the Lost Queen, kind of a year before the Lost Queen ends. So you can see where all these characters are before this big battle takes place. And then through the exile, Lingorith finally becomes a queen in this book, which was really exciting. She'd been waiting a very long time to become queen. And then she's able to finally be reunited with her brother down the line. She can bring him out of exile. But the book follows the storylines of 3 different characters: Lailochen, Lingorith, and Lingorith's daughter Anharad, who's training to become a druid.
which is a really, really interesting process in and of itself, because you have this 8-year-old girl, is that right? Who's sort of discovering the world, but also discovering this this other sort of I guess we would call it's almost supernatural side to her as well, which is you know, don't want to give too many things away, but is fascinating in and of its own right.
Yeah, and we know that Druids had to undergo training for at least 20 years, something that we learned from Julius Caesar, who was fascinated by the Celts. So you can imagine that they probably started their training at a fairly young age. So, I mean, putting myself in Anharad's shoes to choose, it wasn't against her will. She, you know, she chose to go, but to leave your parents at age 8 is really one of the bravest things I think anyone could do in answer to a calling. And so, and the adventure, of course, that Anharad undergoes in this book is in turns harrowing and heart-wrenching. And, you know, she easily became one of my favorite characters throughout this novel.
So I'm so glad you've mentioned that she starts this book sort of on the beginnings of a quest of her own. You have 3 point of view characters here who are all separate at the beginning of this book, and you're sort of picking up threads and moving them through the narrative. How challenging is it as an author to take a book where you have people scattered across a geographical space and continue those threads and keep that tension rolling through that story?
I think because the first book was all Lingora's point of view, for me, writing these 3 narratives and having the freedom geographically to move these characters across Scotland was really exciting for me. And I think the only thing was that it felt most like a leap of faith that somehow we could bring them all back together.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just have, that was really sort of fumbling around in the dark for a while, but then I found this battle in the list of Nennius, the historian, has these 13 battles of Arthur. We don't know where all of them were, but there was this one battle, the Caledonian Wood, and I was searching and researching where they all took place, and that was kind of the key to bringing all these characters back together after they've all had their own really powerful transformations. That's the, you know, the battle that comes at the end of the book. And I feel like we're talking a lot about battles. I was saying last night that I actually don't like writing battles and I don't really like reading them. But in this book, you know, the battles are important and are so, I think they're really moving because they're, I try to relate them in the way that they shape and pull on the characters. And also the battles were real, you know, they were real historical events. We know that in the first battle, Lingorith lost both, her husband was fighting against her own brother, and we know that she lost her eldest son. So I want to make people feel what she felt, because I certainly do. When I'm channeling those emotions and I'm sitting there and I'm in that moment, I'm imagining my own son laying on the grass in that, you know, gasping for breath, and it's gut wrenching, but it's real, you know? And so I think sometimes with battle, it's all gore and it's all machinations and maneuverings of troops. And I really hope that mine are not written in that way.
Well, I think what's interesting and what definitely sets them apart is, to me, as I was reading, they felt like moments of revealing sort of kind of deep emotional elements of the characters themselves. So it wasn't so much, you know, this person goes here and swings this weapon and does this and then goes here. It was more sort of the reasoning behind what was happening, or a reaction to what was happening. You know, if somebody was witnessing the death of a nephew, or, you know, another significant person in their life, or questioning why they were doing this and sort of the point that had gotten them there, it felt like it was almost an opportunity to kind of uncrack some of these characters' walls and reveal what it was that that they were going through, or that was motivating them.
There's nothing more revealing than having to fight for your life and seeing people you love fall beside you. There, it will strip you down to your basest elements. And so that was one of the things that was really powerful about writing those scenes.
I think it's interesting also, you have different people sort of fighting and surviving in different ways in this book. And some of the sort of toughest survivors, I think, are the women. And
Mhm.
to me, this really was a fascinating book because I have read some of the Arthurian legends. I've read, the Once and Future King and various other things. It's very focused on the men, and very well, in my experience, it's been very focused on the men. I think it's so fascinating to take a different approach and to shift that perspective a little bit and really dive into the stories behind the women here. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about these women and what they're going through, what they want, and where you're hoping to bring them as characters.
Well, that's a great question. So Langorith, of course, is starts off in The Lost Queen, the first book, as a girl who wants to become a druid or a wisdom keeper, as I call them in my books. And she doesn't get what she wants. Instead, she has to live the life of a politician. But she begins to grow into that role, and she begins to see the importance of what she can offer to her people. She's a pre-Christian, and she's married to a Christian king who was a historical figure, and he was one of the more famous kings of the early medieval era in Scotland. So you can imagine the divide and the balance that she's always having to strike. And she's someone who has to learn to put aside her own wants in order to foster the survival of a religion that's being threatened, people who are being invaded by new people from across the street, the sea, the Angles. So that's Langorith, and what she wants, I think, in her deepest heart, is to preserve the ways of her people. And I think personally, if she could have it, she would wish for love. But hers is not a love marriage, although I think it's really interesting for me writing these books to see their partnership grow over the course of decades. And you can see, we know that they were married for decades, and the one thing Langorith is remembered for is for being an adulteress. So they survived. If in fact she was an adulteress,
Right.
they survived that, and they stayed together. So that was really interesting to me. Anharad, of course, she wants to become a wisdom keeper because she can't understand these feelings and these urges and gifts that she has inside of her. But her secret desire is to be loved by her family. She's not a woman who, even as she grows into 17 by the end of the Forgotten Kingdom, she doesn't really crave romantic love. I think because she was separated from her family at such a young age, that's the bond that is broken for her. So it's a family. She wants to find a sense of family.
With
Um,
her, it's so heartbreaking because in the start of this book, you see her being fostered by another branch of the family. I think, well, close enough, and you see her also go through the experience of having her father and that family go to war against each other and expecting that she will be traded for, that she will be taken back by her father. And when that doesn't happen, it's this really devastating thing to her, and it feels like there's almost a bit of a breaking point with her at that moment.
You're exactly right. And I think Anharad, when she goes through, as I said, a really harrowing journey, and finally finds a home for herself. And that's where she starts to really grow into her gifts and her talents, up in the land of the Picts in the north of Scotland. And the Picts are a really mysterious people. We don't exactly know what language they spoke.
Mm.
We don't exactly know whether they were just painted their bodies or whether they were actually tattooed. We don't know really even what they called themselves. There's so many questions that we have about the Picts. We don't know where they went.
Mm.
They just, at a certain point in history, the Picts were no more.
I didn't
And
realize
this
that.
happened, yes, and this happened between the probably 8th and 9th centuries. So they sort of just disappeared. And so there's lots of theories about them, but what was really exciting was that was where Anharad felt most at home, is among these new people who don't give their names freely, and really control the entire top half of Scotland. I mean, they were incredibly powerful, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Pictish hill forts you can still go visit today. So that was an exciting part of the book to write about.
I'm curious about the role that religion plays in this book as well, because as you've said, and I apologize, I'm going to need some help with names. The Queen, my apologies.
Elifid.
Elifid is coming from, one sort of, well, she's sort of a bit of a figure in between, right? She's observed one religion, and I believe she's converted to Christianity. Is that right? In sort of, for all intents and purposes. And then you have characters within the same family who are choosing to either observe the old ways, or their brother may be following Christianity now. So this seems like a time of great almost turmoil societally and from a religious perspective. What was it like exploring that within this world?
Well, what was really interesting is for the Forgotten Kingdom, I actually found a new book that I hadn't discovered, and it's called The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixon. And it's about how fundamentalist Christianity destroyed the classical world in Greece and Rome, probably 150 years before Lingorith and Lalacan were born. That hadn't yet come to Scotland, but it was a pretty violent end. All the philosophers had to flee from Athens. They left the academy, which was one of the most famous philosophical colleges in the world. It had been running for over 1,000 years, and it was abandoned, and they were chased out of Athens. So that had all already happened, but in Scotland, none of that was really taking place quite yet. People were very attached to their nature gods and to their old religion. And it really wasn't until, at least in my particular area of Scotland, this fellow named Mungo came along, and he came from not too far outside of Glasgow, but one of the first acts that he did in coming into Glasgow was to cut down all of the sacred oak trees on this Druid hill and bury a Christian body on that hill. So that was a real historical event. And when I read about that, I thought, well, I wonder what Lingorith would have thought of that. This was one of the first acts of religious warfare that they'd ever seen. So I was really taken by that. And then in book 2, what I like is the balance is we get to meet more characters who are, on the moderate spectrum of Christianity. And that's really more the case. It's seldom black and white. And we do know in Glasgow at the time, there were the Teller Christians who were more moderate, and then there were the Mungo Christians who were much more strict and fundamentalist in nature. So writing about that was really interesting. And a lot of the details from the book can be found in Mungo's own biography. So it's a great source to look at.
So it sounds like there is change, but it's not necessarily always violent change. There's sort of slow societal change that happens in terms of Christianity rising within this area and the old religions receding a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Julia. And it's mostly because the Celts were so incredibly intelligent. They welcomed debate and they welcomed choice and freedom. So people were free to choose their own gods. There was never much persecution. I mean, sometimes you'd have Christians being taken into slavery and things like that were not very nice at all. But really, the Celts would invite priests in to debate with their druids. We have several records of that. St. Columba's life talks about that. So they were really open to ideas. And some people said, hey, I like the idea of this Christ guy. I think I'm going to follow that. And it really wasn't a conflict in every circumstance. And of course, in this book, you get to meet Brother Thomas, who's someone who is just, to me, exemplifies the root of Christianity, which is a very loving religion and built on charity and built on kindness. And he comes in and cares for Angharad in a time when she really doesn't have anybody else.
And they have this sort of unique trust that develops very early. It's really interesting to watch. She sort of identifies elements, sort of monk-like elements in him that obviously she was able to understand from her sort of experience as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly, because I wanted to show that, I don't actually think there's much difference in religion. It's the man-made construct of it. So, you know, priests being good or bad people is what makes good or bad priests, and I think that there were certainly very nasty druids around at the time as well. It's the nature of our humanity, and our inner nature that twists religion. And religion, of course, it's just a human construct for divinity. So we manifest it in all of these different cultures. You've got Muhammad, and you've got Yahweh, and you've got all of these different manifestations of just what happens to us when we die. Is there something other than us? So I try to portray the rainbow spectrum of that as much as I can.
You've mentioned a couple of times, some of the work that you did around researching religion, but this is such an incredible world to build. I think people would be really curious about, first of all, what inspired you to look at this era in particular, to look at these stories. Maybe we'll start there, and then we can talk a little bit more about research, which I know you and I chatted a bit about beforehand. But what about the inspiration behind this book?
The inspiration behind this book was discovering Langorith. I read about her in a friend of mine, Adam Ardrey, wrote a book called Finding Merlin. And he's one of the men who has put forth a lot of these theories that Merlin was based off of Lailochen, who lived in southern and central Scotland. And that was the first time I'd ever seen her mentioned. And when I realized that while her brother has been fictionalized, she was a historical figure, I thought, well, that can't possibly be true. It just can't be true, because everyone should know that. And then as I read through her life and I did my own research, I just fell down the rabbit hole, and I felt so much for her. I don't know, I felt a connection to her, and I felt like she wanted her story told. She deserved to have her story told. So really it was through Langorith. I always had loved castles growing up, but I would have picked and preferred to be writing about castles. Instead, I've been plunked into an area where we've got medieval hall houses made of wood. We don't even know what they looked like, really. We know that Iron Age houses were thatched, but there's this huge gap in the archaeological record. And you've got to think things have transformed and changed somewhat during that time. But so a lot of the things we've had to just make educated guesses about. So that would not have been my first choice. But now that I started researching the 6th century, walking to a lot of these hill sites, the fortresses are all built on hills, and you can still see the rings in the landscape underneath the grass from their huge stone and timber ramparts that they all built. And some of these forts were occupied for 1,500 or 2,000 years from tribes, and then the tribes became clans. It's just fascinating. And the fact that you can still go and walk the landscape in this way. And it's nice because no one's really that interested in tromping around hill forts for the most part. Everybody else is at the castle,
Right.
And so it's a very intimate, private experience visiting some of these sites, at least for now. I hope it stays that way too. But
hope it stays that way, but also hope that there's some readers perhaps who will be making some trips out when that's possible, to visit some of these
yes,
places.
I hope so too. Yes, and what would be really nice is that the 6th century really doesn't get a lot of funding in the world of archaeology. And so it would be fantastic if people start to take an interest, because we may be able to start doing more excavations on some of these really important sites.
That's so interesting. I wonder why that is. Do you think it's just, for whatever reason, hasn't been fashionable recently for scholarly work?
I think that, yes, I don't think it's been fashionable. I think that a lot of people don't understand what the geographical spread was really back in the 6th century. But if you tell people, or if you ask most people, who do you think the Scots were? Well, they would say, oh, the Scots have lived in Scotland. Well, the Scots were actually originally Irish.
Mhm.
So, and the people that I'm writing about were Britons. So they spoke a somewhat different dialect of the same language. They couldn't really quite understand each other all that well, but they lived next to each other and they shared a lot of similar beliefs. And then you had the Picts, totally, who knows what their ancestry was or where they came from. There's lots of theories on that. Then you had the Angles coming in. So a lot's been lost. Also, the fact they built out of timber. So all we have is post holes. And so people don't find that very exciting. You can go to a site and find all these beautiful Roman coins or, a Roman hoard in a hill site, like Trappin Law has this really beautiful silver hoard they found. But it's just a bunch of post holes and some
Right.
bumps in the grass, so it's hard to get people excited about that. I think that's probably why. And there's a big fascination, you live in London. Maybe you've noticed this. There's a huge fascination in London with the Roman era. I think in
Well,
England.
every time they excavate something in central London, they hit a Roman archaeological site. So yes, it's always in the news.
And they're always finding drachmas everywhere. It's like, what were the Romans doing with their money? They were just making it rain drachmas all the
I
time. I don't
guess.
even know when all these coins are finding. But yeah, so there's really just not been a lot of due diligence paid to Langorith and her people.
How do you go about researching an era that is so sort of under researched? And I assume that the sources that you must have are doing some speculation here, because as you say, we don't have the buildings. They weren't built of stone, they were timber. And so they do have to make some of these educated guesses, as you've said.
We do still have a lot of art, a certain amount of artifacts. So that's really important. We've got beautiful brooches from that era, pins. We know that the Rome, and also too, a lot of it's based on, a lot of my research and guesswork is based on what we know the Romans had. Because of course, as I've said, there's so much more field work that's been done in the Roman occupation and that whole layer of Britain's history. So we know that they would have had tweezers because the Romans had tweezers. And so you can sort of make some of
Correct.
these educated guesses. But sometimes things like at the Crannog at Loch Tay, they found some really beautiful examples of ancient textiles. So then you're able to start to piece together the clothing. And of course, that predates my time period. So then you're able to say, well, if they had this technology in the Iron Age, then we're pretty safe to say it existed in the 6th century and probably in somewhat of an elevated way. So that's
Sure.
it. Going to a lot of museums is really helpful. And I also go and meet with archaeologists when I go over to Scotland and I run my theories by them. And that really is helpful. Do you think that there could have been the main hill fort might have been on this hill, and where would they have forded the river? And was there glass? Were there windows? Questions like that. They've been really patient with me. It's been very helpful.
Well, I have an interest in historical fashion, although mine tends to not get out of the 19th century, really. But it was interesting because there is such loving detail in this book around, a pin that somebody's father left her, and it's silver and it's etched in, or it's molded in a certain way. And then you're talking about, woolen fabrics and different things, colors, and all of that must be sort of drawn from, as you say, these educated guesses and your ability to sort of extrapolate from what we do know about things that have been found. So every time there's an archaeological dig that uncovers something, you have a whole new trove of things to potentially dive into.
It's like Christmas has come early every time that happens. I absolutely love it. And especially we're starting to find some really fascinating new sites up north where the Picts were living. And we've just found out one of these particular sites, there were thousands of people living on this hill for it. So that's something that's not seen anywhere, reflected anywhere in our modern consciousness, is these tribes of people in the 6th century, thousands of people. And we don't even know of their existence. So I find that exciting.
It feels almost like you're doing the sort of, and I ask a lot of authors this, what's the line between historical accuracy and historical fiction? And here it feels like you're almost world building in the way that a science fiction or fantasy author might, but you have things to base this off of that are real, that are tangible, that are artifacts. Is there Is there a system that you use to sort of keep yourself on track to make sure that, based on your research, you're going to build a scene within the confines of knowing that, this building may have been more elaborately created than another, or somebody might have worn this type of garment or used this type of weaponry?
So I found, being a former book editor, I have a really intense inner critic, and I've found that if I get hung up in that in the writing process, I'll never write a page. So I found what I have to do is I front load all my research. So I've been researching this book, the third book in the series, for the last, year, just researching and reading everything I can get my hands on, and watching documentaries and doing all those things. And then I get to a point where, and it's usually deadline driven,
Yep.
you realize you've got to start, you have to start. And so then I put it aside and I just let myself create. And I find that those elements that I've kind of digested just surface through the story. So you'll have a king, and this king is, his hall will be a reflection of this example of a hall, whereas someone else's will be much more austere because of where, and it all just, it's very natural to me in that way. And then what I'll do is in the revision process, I go back and I say, okay, is this realistic? Would a hall house look like this in this area? What would they be constructed from? So that all comes back in at the tail end again. And that's what I found works for me.
So it turns out that being a book editor can also be very, very helpful in the writing and revision process, so long as you rein in the sort of inner editor while you need to get drafting.
Yes, the inner editor has to go to a shed somewhere. I mean, it's just locked away, which is the hardest part of writing, I think. I think we all battle with our inner critics,
Absolutely.
And then, of course, as you know, once your book is out there, it's not just yours anymore, and you've got all of these voices chiming in, which is the beautiful part of creating something, but it's also can be deafening. So you've got to tune some of that out and just stay focused on the work.
One of the challenges that I think has been interesting writing in the 20th century is that I don't want to say dealing with, because I'm not dealing with. I am privileged enough to have readers who remember some of the events that I am writing about. And in some cases, they may have experienced elements of World War II, or, I have a book from the 1950s that's coming out in December. So I was able to speak to some of the women who actually were a part of the events that I wrote about. Obviously, you're drawing on different sources, you're drawing on different elements, but do you still feel that sense of, I really need to get this right, because I know if I don't, it might pull somebody out of the story, and I might get that dreaded email from somebody saying, actually.
Sorry, they're doing some construction next door. First of all, I'm really envious that you get to speak to women who've lived through. I mean, how amazing that would be, what I would give. That's incredible that you can do that. But yeah, I feel like I have a moral obligation to Langorith, and especially to Lilacan, who's been made into a wizard and fictionalized.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I go to these sites, I do feel close to them, and I do feel them, and they feel like people to me. They don't feel like characters.
Interesting. When you say that you went to the sites, and this is a little bit of what we talked about before, can you describe actually doing the on the ground research? Because this is something that I think fascinates people. The idea of an author actually getting to go and experience and see and smell and touch all of these things around them.
So one of the things that I'll do is look for, in an area, let's say I'm researching the Picts, I look for the largest hill fort, or the one that, you can find most easily, because a lot of them are covered over by trees and they're really hard to find, and they're on private land. And so going to the sites is always using an OS map, Ordnance Survey map, and hiking through and taking pictures of the plants. And then, of course, plants, and noting the animals, and just what does it smell like, and is it cloudy, or is it sunny, or is it cold, and all of those elements are really important when I visit a site. and trying to figure out where the gates were. A lot of these places you can still go and you can see the dip in the rampart, and that's where they would have had the gate tower. So that's really amazing to be able to see. You could say, now you can describe your characters as they're winding their way up to this hill fort. So it's things like that. And also just sitting in those places, I feel like it does bring you closer to your characters. You know, we know that they walked on that very same land. We know they slept in this very same place. So that's a really powerful thing for me. I do believe that land has a certain kind of memory to it, and that if you try, you can access it. I did write a little bit about that. There's some sneaky hints of that in the Forgotten Kingdom, if you know where to look for those.
Mm-hmm. Little Easter eggs for people who pick up on them.
Mm-hmm.
What about the challenge of writing now, where there have been travel restrictions? It hasn't necessarily been possible to go and do some of that on the ground research. Do you feel that, you know, the experience that you've had writing these previous two books has been enough to draw on, or are you hoping to be able to, again, go and sort of walk these places for book 3?
You know, I was hoping it would be, but I found as I was writing the first 100 pages, the energy really started to peter out. And I think that I really do get fed and nourished by going to those sites. I think it re-energizes me. I also always find out something new. One of the discoveries that we made in going to a site was, you know, they say that when Merlin was in exile, he was living at Hartfell, which is outside a little town of Moffat in southern Scotland, right in the border area, near the borders. And everyone always said, well, he lived in the spring and he lived into this cave, and you can still go there and you can see there's an overhang of rock. And there's probably, you know, 3 or 4 feet of height where someone could roll underneath it, maybe with a bivy sack, and sleep for the night if they had to. But you're not going to spend 7 years of winters sleeping under that rock. I don't care how much of a Highlander machismo warrior you are, it's just not going to happen.
No.
And I also know that Lalakin was a lord. So although he was a warrior, he was used to the finer things in life. So when I went to that site with the OS map, one of the things that I noticed was that there was what's called a burnt mound at the base of Hartfell, and alongside a hut circle, and what looked like some sort of earthen rampart. And I thought, well, of course, this is probably the place where, if he really was at Hartfell, he would have been staying in a cozy hut. It wasn't like it was the lap of luxury, but he would have had access to the burnt mound. Those are basically archaeological remains of how the Celts used to make steam houses. So they would channel water and they would heat the water using boulders, almost like a sweat lodge. I don't know if you've ever done a sweat lodge, Julia.
I haven't. I've seen. I understand sort of in theory how this would work, but
so they heat in a sweat lodge. You heat boulders and then you put them into the room, and it creates this really amazing heat. And so the Celts did this, but for cooking and for laundry and for bathing. Mm-hmm. So when we think about the Celts as these unwashed masses, it was absolutely not true. We know there were hundreds and hundreds and thousands of these burnt mounds found throughout Ireland and Scotland and beyond. So there's a burnt mound there. So he would have been quite comfortable and able to at least bathe and, you know, wait out the time until he was welcomed back at court. It's kind of an exciting discovery. But again, that's something that you can only find in going to the site. And it changed the entire narration of my book. Instead of living in a cave, he's in a hut with these other warriors, and that never would have happened had I not gone to the site.
And that must change sort of the progression of the character as well, because depending on the experiences that you're going to be putting him through, he's going to have different reactions when he then is sort of making decisions about what he's going to do next, you know, when events happen to him.
Yes, and it just felt so much more on an intuitive level. When you find something like that, it feels so much more relatable. It takes him out of the realm of the magician and the man who was able to survive this harrowing feat, 7-year feat with, you know, snow up to his thighs. It brings you closer to the real person. And that's what I'm really trying to do in these books. I mean, my characters are flawed intentionally. They suffer from, you know, making terrible choices sometimes, and they also astound me at other points with their bravery. And that's what I think is, that's real humanity to me.
I think it's such an interesting approach to sort of humanize a myth and humanize a group of historical figures that we just don't know a huge amount about because of the limitations of the historical record that you've mentioned. It's so interesting. Is there something in particular that you hope readers take away from reading this trilogy and reading this book in particular?
Well, I talk a lot about this, so if anyone's tuning in who's heard me talk other days, I apologize. But one thing that I really hope readers take away is the fact that these books are historical fiction; they are not fantasy. There are elements, suspension of disbelief in the first book, one moment, and then, but for the most part, the pre-Christian religion is no more fantastical than any sort of Christian belief in God. I think believing in God is a kind of magic, isn't it? I mean, to take that leap, to believe there's this other power. And yet we don't call those religions fantasy. So my point is to try to shed some light on the fact that what makes a religion magical is the fact that we believe we have the power to effect a change with a prayer or a curse. And it's on both sides of the table. Both Christians and pre-Christians in the 6th century believed they had the power to curse people or to raise a wind, influencing the weather. Mm-hmm. That sounds magical, but guess what? If you were a sailor in the 6th century, you would go down to your local priest or your druid and you would say, listen, man, here's a coin. I really need to summon a wind because I haven't had fish in weeks and I've got to go take the boat out today. And they would do it, or they would try, and you would either believe or not believe based on the outcome. So that's really one of the things I hope readers take away from these books, is that our life today is just as magical as life was in the 1500s. And perhaps there's a way that we can take those lessons and re-enchant our own lives in the way that these people used to live.
I love that idea of re-enchanting your own life. I think that's a fantastic idea for readers. Speaking of readers, we have some questions, and if you guys do have questions, please drop them in the comments. I am double checking and seeing what you guys have asked. So if you don't mind, we might do just a little bit of a rapid fire round, if that sounds good to you.
I love rapid fire.
Okay, wonderful. So first, I know I'm going to get grief for this if I don't ask this, because my assistant, Mark, who it pops up in the comments sometimes, is Scottish. And he says he's really enjoying the discussion so far. He wants to know what your favorite place that you visited in Scotland is. He's Scottish and he's ashamed that you've seen so much more than he has. So.
Oh, don't worry, Mark, you'll fix it soon. Well, one of my favorite places that everyone can go visit today that I found and I write about in the Forgotten Kingdom is this little village called Fortingall. And in the village of Fortingall, a lot of scenes in the book take place there, especially with Anharad. And there's this yew tree that some people believe is 2,000 years old. So I went to visit that site, and there's a beautiful hotel that you can stay. You can stay while you're there, the Fortingall Inn or something, I think it's called, but it's beautiful. And it's right beside the church with the yew tree. And you can read the info sign, which says, we think that before this was a church, it was a site of pre-Christian worship. Really magical place.
Interesting.
And of course, Dumbarton Rock is just incredible. In my books, it's called Clyde Rock, but it's one of the oldest fortification strongholds in Scotland. It's been the longest continually occupied fortress in Scotland as well. And so you can still go there and visit and climb up to the hills and look out over the rivers. And it's a really magnificent site. William Wallace was held captive there as well. So it's had a huge, long history. Mm-hmm. That's a really amazing place. But my favorite place of all is Châtellerault Country Park, which is where we think Lailechen and Llangorith grew up and ran around and played in the woods as children. And you can go visit Châtellerault Country Park today. It's in a little town in Hamilton, just outside of Glasgow.
And knowing Scotland everywhere is beautiful, because Scotland is so incredibly beautiful.
It is a magnificent country.
Wonderful. We have a question from Anissa, who asks, "What are you most proud of as an author?"
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Probably writing this book at all, The Forgotten Kingdom. It was really tough. It came at a time of huge transition in my own life. And then, of course, I was having to finish it on deadline, and I was late during COVID, single momming to my child, Asa, and writing into the early hours and waking up to take him to school. And at the same time, we had some things developing on the television front, so that was exciting. But I would get an email asking for information, sometimes at 11 o'clock at night, and I would just be trying to go to sleep to wake up at 6 with my son. And so it felt relentless. It felt really relentless. And there were days where I just was completely drained. And so I think this book, I've given more of myself than probably anything else that I've written. And I'm really, really intensely proud of this book. It also pushed me as far as my fiction writing skills, because I was writing a triple narrative for the first time, and I was trying to make these voices sound unique and still authentic to each character. I was worried I wasn't going to be able to do it, in a way that was going to be discernible enough for the reader. So that was a big concern. And just the scope of the events and writing battles. We talked about how writing battles was not natural to me initially. So all of that, yes. So I think The Forgotten Kingdom is my most proud moment of my career thus far.
Yeah, I could certainly see why. It's an incredible book. You mentioned television a little bit there, and I think people would be very curious with what you can share about that side of things as well.
Yeah, so I could just say that we've optioned the TV rights to this really fantastic company, Made Up Stories, and we are still in development, but things were slowed down from COVID, but now hopefully things will be picking up soon, and it's still in the works. Really exciting.
Wonderful. I think one of the things that people sometimes don't realize about publishing and then television and movie as well is it can be a process of hurry up and wait. And so, there's different stages, and things have to go through the development stage, certainly before it becomes the show that you see on the screen, just like things have to go through the various editorial stages that they would as a book before you actually get the book in your hands. It's a much, much longer process than you might expect.
Yes, and I'm a total novice in it, so it's a new beginning and a lot of new learning about how to tell stories in a visual way, which has been really exciting. Just reading the script, you get to see how easy it is to convey something that takes a writer 5 pages to try to get across, and they can make it hit home with just an expression. And I get really excited about that. I'm like, wow, that's so powerful. I can't believe we get to do it. And it's also super frustrating because you don't really have that luxury all the time. You still have to describe the expression, right?
So it's a different skill, right? It's as opposed to sort of, I'm sure people in television think, it'd be so great if I could just have a moment to sort of go into somebody's inner monologue here and describe what it is that I want to express. The novelist is sitting there saying, it's so great that you just get to see somebody, and an actor can convey that thing.
Exactly. You're so right. You're so right. Yes.
I think it's going to be really interesting to watch that process, and I know I've got my fingers crossed for you. So
thank you. You never know with TV things, but hopefully it'll all turn out.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question from appropriately named Arthur here. What do you think are the lessons from our time coming out of your research of the era that you bring to life for us in the book? And I know you touched a little bit on some of that, sort of recapturing the magic in our own lives, but are there additional things that you would hope?
Such a good question. Yeah, I think that's such an amazing question. Wow, Arthur. I think tolerance is a big part of what these books teach us. We're coming out of a time in our country where there was not a lot of tolerance and there was not a lot of grace given a lot of people. We can talk about Black Lives Matter. We can talk about the Me Too movement. This is a time where I think we're starting to wake up out of thousands of years of various sorts of oppression. And it's been a really painful awakening, and it hasn't just been in America, it's been across the world, and it's come with some violence, and it's come with COVID on top of everything else. I think what the Celts bring us is a sense of remembering about the value of intellectual discourse and being able to debate. You know, they come out of the school of the philosophers, and you know, you can get heated but still have a conversation. And another thing too is the warriors and their sense of honor.
Mm.
You know, most battles were decided when one side started to win, and then someone would grant quarter, so no more lives had to be lost. I mean, there are so many lessons like that that we could learn. And of course, too, the 6th century was also in certain ways a really brutal time. There was slavery back in the 6th century as well. Most people owned other human beings. But I think that those lessons of tolerance, those lessons of honor, and then I think one of the things that charms me the most is how much a sense of humor and how much valuing intelligence and wit can really enrich a culture. Mm-hmm. We know for a fact that the Celts were some of the cleverest and funniest and wittiest. I mean, you still go to Ireland or Scotland and they'll take the piss from you. You know, it's just like
it's cultural, certainly. Having a Scottish
really
brother-in-law.
It is cultural, and it is so magnificent. And we sometimes take ourselves so seriously, which they absolutely love, because as soon as they see someone who takes themselves seriously, you are the perfect target. So really, like, honoring wit and honoring intelligence. And you know, they used to speak in riddles, and you'd have to try and figure out what the other was saying. It's just awesome. And I think we could use a little bit more of that in today's world.
Yeah, I agree. We have a question here about your reading, a couple questions actually about reading. So Kathy wants to know, when you were a child, what authors inspired you?
Well, when I was a child, my father read us Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and he used to take us to, my mother would read to us most nights, but my father would take us to the woods and sit us on a log in the autumn sunshine after school. And we never wanted to go for some reason. We just wanted to, you know, I want to be like little brats and go home and watch TV or something. But he would feel like, no, we're going to the woods, and take us to the woods. And those are the memories that really stick with me, is like sitting in upstate New York in the autumn, in this kind of autumn afternoon light, and reading Prince Caspian. And
that sounds pretty incredible as an adult.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know.
it enchants your natural world. You can see as if you're in the story, and the story is happening right with you. And so that was really powerful for me. I think it created a gateway to the imagination, and that it wasn't some other place, but we could reach those places just right here, out in, especially in nature. Mm-hmm. For me. And then I read The Mists of Avalon as a 15-year-old, and it completely blew my mind that the sense of magic and the way that Marion Zimmer Bradley expressed it felt so authentic, and I'd never encountered that before. I think there were a whole lot of people who got really interested in witchcraft and made their names Morgaine back in those days.
Yeah.
I was like, you know, tooling around with Wiccan, and I was like, and my name will be Morgaine, and me and 50,000 other women. So it was really funny. But yeah, so those are kind of the most influential books.
There's a reader on this chat who said that and unfortunately I can't find the comment right now. It's slipped away from me, but she said that the Mists of Avalon were sort of where everything started for her, reading wise. So I think that is certainly a common one for a lot of people, I suspect.
Yes.
What about books that you're reading at the moment? Is there anything in particular that you've been recommending? I hate to put you on the spot in terms of the moment anybody asks me that, I have to go to my Goodreads list. But is there anything that you've been enjoying in particular?
Well, I'm reading Patrick Rothfuss. He writes The Name of the Wind was his first book. He's a fantasy author, and I'm into the second book now, which is The Wise Man's Fear. And I find it really hard. I don't know about you, Julia, but I find it really hard to read historical fiction when I'm writing historical fiction. I don't know. I'm still trying to analyze why I find that to be the case, but you're worried you're going to inadvertently borrow something. You're analyzing it. It's not pleasurable for me. Even though you don't want to, that's what happens because that's your jam. You can't take your head out of it. So reading fantasy is really fantastic because it really does whisk me off. And Patrick Rothfuss is such an amazing storyteller. You feel really at ease in his hands. So I'm partway through that. And I mean, each of his books are 1,000 pages.
I was to say, those are hefty
So
books. Yeah,
it's
my
a
sister is a
commitment to
great
carry
fantasy
it
reader.
around. You feel like, well, I have to read it because if I don't get through it, I'll be lugging it around all summer. But so that's what I'm reading for fun. And then right now I have a suitcase full of books that are all for the Forgotten Kingdom, which are all about like the Scottish invaders and, the Anglo-Saxons and all of that
All the
stuff.
research books.
That's mostly what I'm reading right now. Yeah.
Nice. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I want to be sure that people can make sure that they can find you and follow you, and especially since we've had some questions about the third book and when that might be coming out. So, what is the best place to find you on the internet?
So you might have noticed, some of you on Facebook, I don't have a Facebook account. It was hacked. And so Simon & Schuster is trying to help me recover it. So for now, it's kind of been a nice break, though I've missed everybody. So I'm not on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram under Signe Pike. I'm on Twitter, and you can find me on my website, which has all sorts of updates about books. And book 3 is going to come out in September of 2024.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I know people are going to be very excited to see that when it's out on shelves, and hopefully they'll be able to follow along and certainly read this book in the meantime. So, thank you so much, Signe. I really appreciate you joining us and
It's
sharing.
a pleasure.
Yeah, sharing a bit about your story. So, thank you so much. I will be back next week for the last of this sort of season of Ask an Author. So I will see you all next week, and goodbye.
Thank you.